and welcome again to the Global Agriculture Innovation Forum. We're pleased you've joined us for this, the second session in our final theme of the forum, focusing on scaling. Today, our panel will be discussing the challenges and opportunities associated with scaling up efforts when moving from projects to system-level changes. As we have done all year long, today we bring to the stage global thought leaders and experienced practitioners to address this topic. I'm Gerald Shively, Associate Dean and Director of International Programs in the College of Agriculture at Purdue University, your host for the forum. On behalf of the organizing committee, our advisory group, and everyone contributing to this effort, I'd like to welcome you. I'd also like to thank USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service for sponsoring this series of events. If you are joining us for the first time, please note that recordings of all forum events are available on the forum website. To lead today's discussion, I am pleased to introduce our moderator, Tim Pruitt, CEO of the Hunger Project. I'll now turn it over to Tim to introduce our topic and our speakers. I hope you enjoy the program, and please stay for the live question and answer session that will follow the presentations.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome. I'm Tim Pruitt, President and CEO of the Hunger Project, and I'm honored to be your moderator for today's session. We have a terrific lineup of speakers and a lively discussion ahead here at the Global Agricultural Innovation Forum. And I want to ask you all to jump in. Post your questions in the Q&A window. Now, as most of you know, the Global Agriculture Innovation Forum is a joint undertaking between the USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service and Purdue University's Office of International Programs in Agriculture. And this forum is designed to advance our collective understanding of innovation and to be of value to entrepreneurs, producers, value chain operators, researchers, as well as donor agencies and implementing partners. Already, we have seen that value and the advance in the shared knowledge in the first 5 themes. The previous 5 themes in the series have highlighted the many areas of innovation, from innovation in entrepreneurship to post-harvest management to the genetic improvement of agricultural systems. Now, today's topic focuses on reaching scale and changing systems. Without scale and ultimately transforming our agricultural system, development outcomes are unlikely to be achieved. And we all know how challenging systems change can be. This world has become more complex in recent years due to our growing population and its demand for more food, water, and energy, the limited arable land for expanding food production, and the increasing pressures on natural resources. Climate change threatens all life on the planet. So the need for system change is great. And when you look at systems change in history, you see 2 drivers. One is a crisis, or it's an overwhelming demand for change. The second is technology and innovation, which we know are coming at a pace never seen before. And if you look back at the history of agriculture, we have 4 standout innovations that drove agricultural system change: the combustible engine, hybridization of seeds, development of commercial fertilizer, and crop protection products. Combined, these 4 caused a revolution in agriculture, one which drove production, resulted in an unprecedented surplus. It's also a system we are actively modifying and adapting as the unintended environmental, sustainability, and human health consequences become more challenging each year. So, in partnership with the Scaling Community Practice, today we're going to build on the momentum created from past efforts, such as Purdue and the African Development Bank's partnership on the Scale Up Conference in 2018, as well as some current scholarship on scaling of agricultural innovations. And we have 4 terrific expert panelists. What they have in common is they all bring terrific examples and insights to the work from all around the world, from Africa to India and North America. I'll introduce each panelist just before they speak, but here they are in turn. Dr. Namakula Kovic, our Senior Research Coordinator from International Food Policy Research Institute. Dr. Sean Ferris, Senior Technical Advisor, Livelihoods and Markets for Catholic Relief Services. Dr. Sudhir Kumar Goel, former Additional Chief Secretary in Maharashtra, India. Now, to start us off, we have Dr. Richard Cole. He's the president and lead consultant for a firm called Strategy, Impact, and Learning. Dr. Cole is internationally recognized as a thought leader and expert on scaling impact. And he's worked for many years with USAID's Bureau of Resilience and Food Security on integrating and scaling up agricultural innovations. He's the co-author of a well-regarded MSI scaling framework and currently working to support scaling of farmer field and business schools that have a strong gender transformation component. Richard, over to you to start our discussion.
Today I'm going to talk about two things. First, a set of principles for scaling up that I have developed for the scaling community of practice, working with Johannes Lind. As many of you know, Johannes, along with Larry Cooley, is one of the two co-chairs of the community of practice. Second, I will spend a few minutes trying to apply at least some of these principles to a couple of case studies of scaling agricultural innovations. Let me start with talking about the principles. These principles are based on a paper that I was commissioned to write, along with Johannes, by the Scaling Community of Practice. They're now ready. The paper has been finished, or at least a draft is ready, and has been posted on the Community of Practice website. And Johannes and I would very much welcome your comments. I hope we can put a link to the paper as well as some of the principles in the chat today. The reason that the Community of Practice commissioned this paper was to provide some ideas or principles that one could recommend to practitioners of scaling about what good or thoughtful scaling actually looks like in practice. The community felt like it needed these principles because there is currently not really a consensus on what a good or thoughtful approach to scaling actually looks like. In fact, as many of you know in your own organizations, whether you're an innovator, a funder, an implementer, or something else, even if the organization has stated publicly and is on the record for that it's committed to scaling and claims that it's doing scaling, often the practice diverges a bit from the stated commitment. And that practice varies quite widely in terms of what scaling seems to be done. So the hope here is that practitioners would take a look at these principles and find them useful and apply them regardless of their role in the whole scaling ecosystem. The paper was based on three sources. First, Johannes and I did a review of relevant literature on scaling. Secondly, we interviewed a number of key scaling practitioners who work in the field. And thirdly, we drew on our own experience of 15, 20 years of working in the scaling field ourselves. The paper is a bit different from a lot of the principles that you may have seen out there. In a sense, it's not just a list of 5 or 6 short phrases, but actually goes into quite a bit of depth. We've organized it in a layered approach around 5 key issues in scaling. First of all, what a scaling vision looks like, what should be scaled, who are the actors that should be involved in scaling, how should scaling be actually done in practice, and what types of evidence is needed to support scaling. The second layer are 8 principles that fall in these 5 categories. And then for those principles, we have 20 lessons of how to apply them. And in fact, there's even more layers. It's a fairly rich paper. And for each lesson, we offer some guidance on how to apply that lesson and also some cautions about where or where not to apply it. We do not presume that this is universal, and all of these principles lessons are applicable to all cases of scaling. I don't have time today to read through the 8 principles or the 20 lessons, but I do hope we can post them in the chat. And what I'm going to do instead is illustrate at least a handful of the lessons by referring to 2 case studies. The first case study is a case study of scaling of a new variety of rice that was introduced in Senegal called Sahel rice. And the second was the introduction and scaling of agricultural machinery in southwest Bangladesh. Both of these were done through USAID projects. In fact, both of them required at least 2 projects or an extension beyond the normal few years of a project. And the other thing they have in common is that while both focused on the technology, in one case, a new rice variety, and in another case, a set of different kinds of agricultural machinery in Bangladesh, in practice, the majority of the scaling effort actually involves scaling value chain components and affecting other types of systems change, and particularly in creating and managing multi-stakeholder partnerships. And as we'll see in a minute, this was quite very much aligned with the principles that are in the paper that I've been referring to. So let me start with a lesson, one of the critical lessons, I think, and something that we really focused on, is the importance of taking a systems perspective and beginning with analyzing relevant systems, issues, and challenges, and then aligning or creating space for those for scaling in those systems, relevant systems. I'll read part of lesson 10, which reads, map the relevant systems and context, taking into account complexity. Align scaling with existing constraints or create space and the enabling conditions for scaling through systems change. In Senegal, the USAID team implementing this project, it was called the Projet Croissance Économique, did a lot of this systems analysis up front, and this led them to identifying a number of parts of this value chain and other market systems that were bottlenecks, which they then worked on to address to scaling. And in fact, when they addressed some of the bottlenecks, this led to an increased productivity and throughput through the system, which then led to other bottlenecks and led to an approach which they called something like a virtuous circle. And very much, I think, aligned with a systems approach and issues of complexity that lesson 10 illustrates. In Bangladesh, actually, we have sort of the counterexample where the team implementing the project didn't really look at some of the systemic issues up front and was forced to confront them later. A couple of examples of these were challenges in motivating and achieving widespread retail distribution, and also service after sales, and had to work on strengthening the system in those and a number of other areas. Okay. A second lesson that was key to successful scaling in both instances was iteration and adaptation, which is lesson 17. And again, to read that, iterate and adapt. Apply a cycle of experimentation, learning, and strategic adjustments supported by evidence. Revisit decisions about whether to scale and the vision of what, how, who, and overall strategy regularly. In the Bangladesh case, this question of iteration and adaptation is illustrated by the fact that the project actually started, with a number of machinery and found that some were more appropriate to farmers in the context than others, and some had to be modified or adapted to be more aligned with farmers' needs. Very much an iterative approach. And as I mentioned, the Senegal project kept iterating and adapting its work plan regularly as new bottlenecks emerged as they addressed old ones. In both cases, they adapted monitoring and evaluation systems that really worked more on monitoring on a regular basis. And in fact, in Bangladesh, they developed a dashboard approach of almost real-time data on machinery sales in terms of who was buying them, what they were using it for, what kind of crops, location, how profitable it was, and used this to adapt their strategy regularly. As many of you know, this type of adaptive approach or iterative approach is a bit of a departure from what many USAID projects do of developing a work plan at the beginning of a project and then just regularly implementing it over several years, at best with some revisions on annual work plans. In both of these cases, the activities of the projects and their scaling efforts were iterative, very iterative, adaptive, in much shorter timeframes. The next example of a lesson is about the importance of partnerships. And partnerships were quite critical in both cases. Both projects didn't really do much direct implementation, but actually found partners, private sector partners, and leveraged partnerships. And this aligns with Lesson 8, which states, create and leverage partnerships and collaboration to mobilize resources for effective implementation and political support. Ensure partners have adequate resources, management, and governance structures. In Bangladesh, these partners were primarily large agricultural machinery companies. In Senegal, there were a variety of partners at various points in the value chain, such as rice millers and processors. So I don't have time to go through many of the other lessons that were relevant, and I hope that, given the time limits of my presentation, you will see that these lessons, this will motivate you to take a look at the paper, and that the lessons and principles will be something that you can find useful to apply in your work in scaling. Thank you very much for your time, and look forward to your feedback on the paper, the principles, and the lessons.
Thank you very much, Richard. And you'll find many things there worth going deeper. And I just want to encourage everyone in the audience, add your questions into the chat box at any time, and we'll get to those questions after we finish hearing from all panelists. Our next panelist, Dr. Nemukolo Kovic. She's the Senior Research Coordinator at IFPRI. Her work includes promoting the use of evidence by the African Union and Ethiopian government that addresses food security and nutrition. She has a dual background in agriculture and nutrition, and her expertise straddles the interface of policy, dynamics of agricultural and food systems, and how research could inform the intended impact for low, middle-income countries. She's a member of the African Academy of Sciences Steering Committee on Food and Nutrition Security, and we're delighted to have her with us today. Dr. Kovic, over to you.
Greetings, my name is Namkolo Kovic. I'm a Senior Research Coordinator at IFPRI in Ethiopia, where I coordinate the research program on agriculture for nutrition and health, A4NH. I'm pleased for the opportunity to present to you on research and programs to support national food systems transformation, and specifically CGIAR multi-stakeholder lessons from Africa. Let me start by painting a picture of the CGIAR research landscape where the examples I will share are embedded. There are 14 research centers, 8 agri-food systems research programs, 4 global integrating programs, and A4NH is one example. And then there are also 4 research support platforms, and an example here is the gender platform. A4NH, where the examples I share are embedded, has got 5 research flagships on food systems for healthier diets, biofortification, food safety, on programs and enabling action through research, and on human health. To promote a shift from project to systems change, we have used 3 different pathways: a development programs pathway, a policies pathway, and an agri-food value chains pathways. Through these pathways, we contribute to program goals for A4NH, primarily on improved food and nutrition security for health, but more broadly also contributing to the other CGIAR goals that are indicated on this slide. The first example I want to give is that on biofortification, where we've had significant successes. The micronutrients that have been targeted have been iron, zinc, and vitamin A, all micronutrients of significant concern on the African continent because of high prevalence of deficiencies. Crops that have been released include iron millet, iron beans, vitamin A sweet potato, vitamin A cassava, and vitamin A maize. The achievements on biofortification have made use of the different pathways on policies, programs, and value chains that I referred to earlier. So starting from crop trait research and crop development, seed multiplication, all the way to retail products being developed and engaging the multiple stakeholders that are involved, including government, have all been part of the process. In terms of programs in Zambia for vitamin A maize, for example, it was included in the National Input Supply Program so that smallholder farmers could actually get the assistance that they required to grow the vitamin A maize. The private seed producers have come on board and now producing vitamin A maize seeds as well. So this contributes to systems change. Using the three impact pathways, it was possible to move from 1.7 million households growing biofortified crops in 2014 to 9.7 million by 2020. And so these pathways have shown potential in moving from projects towards systems change. The second example I give is from Ethiopia on positioning for food systems transformation. Here we started with a consultatively identified food systems research agenda, and this then led to structuring projects that would be catalytic to using diets to inform food systems transformation. One of the first projects we have had was developing food-based dietary guidelines, for which two objectives were identified. The first, to provide dietary recommendations for Ethiopians 2 years and older for increased diet quality, including diversity and food safety for optimal health. The second objective was then to promote broad food systems actions to support diet quality with sensitivity to sustainability. And this second objective was brought on board because of realizing that as is, the existing food system does not make a nutrient-dense food basket accessible to the majority of Ethiopian. But then we used this second objective as an entry point into the UN Food Systems Summit process in Ethiopia to anchor evidence in the National Food Systems Transformation Pathway. And the pathway that has been developed by the government has actually taken a nutrient-dense centered approach to the transformation pathway, and it is embedded in a country policy process as well as in country programs, which positions them for uptake. And so it's really a good example of shifting from projects towards systems change. The third example is on Aflasef, a natural biological control products to reduce aflatoxin contamination. And from research that produced the product, this has moved towards scaling up with manufacturing companies coming on board and setting up prototype factories in different countries. In addition to that, there has also been move with 6 countries incorporating the Aflasef as an intervention in their national agricultural investment plans under CADEP. It is again an example where policies and programs as well as a value chain pathway have been adopted to really promote this move from project towards systems change. We're now moving towards 1CGR, and for the 1CG, we are working around 3 systems pillars systems transformation, genetic innovation, and resilient agri-food systems. And these are anchored around regional integrated initiatives and also around country actions. And the idea is to actually have an ambitious, adaptable, but well coordinated process that would be catalytic to country and regional impacts. And the impact areas that have been identified on nutrition, health, and food security, poverty reductions, livelihoods and jobs, gender equity, youth and social inclusion, climate adaptation and mitigation, as well as environmental health and biodiversity. In order to have impacts in such broad areas, it will be necessary to engage with government policies, programs, and related value chains to really move any innovations that are developed from project towards contributing to systems change. The key messages I would like to leave you with are that envisaged research outcomes should be positioned for adoption and scale up. And for this, we need to pay attention to policies, programs, and value chains, as well as the relevant stakeholders. It is important to engage with the relevant stakeholders and, where feasible, even work with them as co-creators. Impacts of research for development depends on government actions for uptake. And so engaging with the relevant government stakeholders early in the process is important. And for the 1CGIR, it is envisaged to generate accelerated progress from better coordinated actions that can catalytically foster meaningful systemic transformation, targeting countries and regional impacts. And again, for this, there will be need to make a concerted effort to move from project to systems change. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kovic. Much appreciated. And of course, more food for thought for our audience here. And I just want to again ask folks, if you have a moment, have a question, please put it in the Q&A box and we'll address those at the end. Questions for Dr. Kovic or Dr. Cole, both welcome here. Our next panelist, Dr. Sean Ferris. He's the Senior Technical Advisor, Livelihoods and Markets for Catholic Relief Services. Dr. Ferris leads CRS's global team of agricultural experts working in 51 countries. He focuses on supporting smallholder farmers along the pathway to prosperity. Dr. Ferris has been working in agricultural innovation for more than 32 years, with programs including USAID, USDA, and the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, as well as IFAD and the UK Department for International Development and the World Bank. Dr. Ferris, over to you.
I'm going to be talking to you over the next 10 minutes then about scaling in fragile states and the sort of work that we're doing at CRS in order to basically put in the groundwork for the work that we're doing in humanitarian and agricultural development in fragile states to really set the scene for follow-on scaling. Now, as many of you will know, we tend to start with our conceptual frameworks where we look at life in a bit of a linear way. So we see, people that are in very vulnerable states. With asset transfers, we can get them to a recover state. We build skills, we link people to services, and basically we build their pathway to resilience or to prosperity in a fairly market-based linear process. Unfortunately, of course, life is not really quite like that. And what I'd really like to focus on today is what is happening in this interplay between humanitarian emergency support and recovery. And what we're seeing across many different parts of the world where we work is this pendulum swing between these two states. And basically, we have to put in place the right types of interventions to get people to a point where we can start to get them to that market pull situation. And I think you've heard from other speakers about scaling being done through the state or scaling being done through market systems. What I'm really talking about is what happens when the state is not able to provide that scaling economic power, or perhaps the private sector is not strong enough to really propel people in a market-based economy. So really going back to the classic model about scaling with innovation, intermediation, and delivery at scale, I'm going to be talking today more about intermediation. I think this type of work doesn't get a lot of airplay. And what I'd like to do is describe to you the types of things that we are doing in order to set the stage then for that second phase process. So just to say that the work that I'm involved with is mainly in East Africa. And so we are working in this situation where we are linking humanitarian responses to development work. And you probably have read in the news recently that this region, which used to be one of the most stable regions, I think, in Africa, is experiencing quite a lot of challenges at the moment. Just think about Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia. These are the countries where governance is fragmenting in many places. And over a long period of time, climate change is really affecting the ability of people to cope with a recurrent series of shocks. And quite often, that shock is with more people and more intense levels of shock. What I'm going to do today then is talk about some examples from Sudan and just try and provide you with some insights into how a more robust and, if you like, escalating process of intermediation provides both the groundwork for scaling safety net operations, which I think is becoming a really powerful process, and how this work is also providing conditions for setting the enabling variables, if you like, for more market-based interventions. And a really important part of this work then is the ability to be agile or have the information to be able to pivot between humanitarian activities and development activities, and to do that in a way which takes into account shocks, hopefully actually anticipates some levels of shock, and then can quickly get people back to that development process when conditions allow that. So yeah, just to underline this, the pathway that we see to resilience and scaling is not linear. The shocks are real, they're recurrent, and they are pretty extensive and intensive. The intervention teams that we work with really have to find ways of limiting key factors, addressing those root cause problems, and then layering in different types of activities to build skills. And the work that we're doing, I think, is really critical roles in fostering the links between competing communities, because very often we see that communities are really in competition to access and use the same natural resources. Those resources are diminishing. That causes tension, conflict, and then you spiral into that very negative situation where things become open to outright conflict, and then governance systems drop away, and it's impossible in that stage to scale activities. So the intermediation process then works at the humanitarian and development levels, and that kind of network process through different types of collaboration is working at kind of the 1 million, even up to 10 million people level. So in a way, these are fairly scaled interventions already. And what we've done is develop this idea of nexus programming, and that is really to overcome multiple constraints whilst also looking to get to more market-based solutions. Scale of the need. Okay, so 14 million people in Sudan currently are in need of some sort of asset transfers. Local governance systems at the moment totally overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis. Essentially, you're looking at lack of access to water and quality soils, which provides people with their livelihood opportunities. What we're also seeing is a pretty data-thin environment, so that also hinders the ability to assess, forecast, and to target activities to the right people. So just to think about what is this nexus programming then? So it's really a combination of 2 or 3 things: improved natural resources combined with peace building, and then looking at livelihood opportunities. So as I said, we're looking at a situation where more people are competing for diminishing amounts of land and water. Tensions created by that often escalate into conflict, and that loses years of investment. So it's a very costly process when that happens. In the Darfur region, what we're looking at in terms of being able to use natural resources more effectively, share that with more people, is to really look at a radical upgrading in natural resource management infrastructure, combined with the ability of competitive groups of people to manage those systems. So in effect, this is an intermediation process which works with conflicting competitive groups of people and provides them with a new process to use the commons in a more cohesive and effective way. And that diagram, or that picture on the right there, is just showing something called a sand dam, which is a fairly basic bit of infrastructure. But when that is put into place, that has a transformative effect on the amount of water that communities can access. And that provides us with the ability to basically provide more water and more productive land to more people. So resilience programming then, as we're looking at this process, and this is going from this first order idea of how can we basically stabilize communities with this nexus programming, that's followed then by what we're thinking is, second order processes, more to do with skills building, enabling people to have the ability to plan and be able to respond to shocks as they occur, also integrating into that program fee-for-service systems that as people emerge from emergency situations, they can start to use those to build, if you like, the basics of the services. And that then enables them to go to this third level where we layer in and integrate more business level approaches, better links to markets. And if you like, that allows us to think about co-investing with farmers and private sector or formal private sector, which gets us back to that more traditional process of private sector-led scaling. So really, it's a process of sequencing and layering different types of activities and making sure that people have the foundational skills, the right set of assets in order for them to consolidate and then build from that process. Just as a final couple of thoughts on this, currently, this is a fairly data-thin environment, and we are also developing high-frequency data collection systems, looking at this idea of resilience and using, if you like, some sort of early warning systems to be able to provide information from outside to communities so that they're aware of things like changes in weather, pest and disease outbreaks, things like economic shocks that may be happening, and also to be able to build a bottom-up process so that the communities can actually start to give us information about what's affecting them and how they're coping with that situation. And particularly if they're not coping with that situation, again, we can then pivot back to more asset transfers to get people through difficult situations without resorting to really negative coping strategies or resorting to conflict. Now, we're doing this with a bunch of different research partners, Cornell University, national institutions, government, but also thinking about how we can build these resilience programming approaches. And having done that in a couple of other countries like Malawi and in Madagascar, those strategies have then been scaled through World Bank and governments. So they're setting up better systems. And that, I think, puts us in a much better situation, utilize the information from communities and help them to engage more effectively with their environment and actually to build a better system and a better business environment for them to grow. So just to cover those ideas again, Nexus programming, this is a process where we assess, we build social cohesion, we work with communities, and we're starting to build this process of basic infrastructure development to kind of 1, 2, 3 million people levels. WFP in these countries is up to, as I said, more like 8, 9, 10. We're also building evidence from the communities that we're working with so that we can actually find effective packages of solutions which help them build their resilience. And that's a fairly long-term process, so it's a patient process. And we're looking to use these approaches to build much more effective intermediation so that we, as I said, set the ground or the foundations for improved social cohesion, better co-investment from communities to build that infrastructure, and those systems, and then enable that platform for subsequent scaling. And we think that's pretty, critical to working in these fragile state situations. And as I said, also trying to look at integrating these roles, bringing together communities, state actors, private sector, and laying those foundations so that we can engage with the private sector to go from 1 or 2 million to 10 plus million. So thank you very much, and looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Ferris. And just another reminder, if you have questions for Dr. Ferris or the other panelists, please use the Q&A box. We'll get to them after we finish with our fourth and final panelists. Our fourth and final panelist, Dr. Sudhir Kumar Goel, former Additional Chief Secretary in Maharashtra, India. Dr. Goel served in senior positions in the field of agriculture and cooperation for the state of Maharashtra, and he's extensive experience working on projects funded by the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and IFAD. Dr. Goel has special interest in establishing public-private partnerships for integrated value chains, and he currently works as a consultant in establishing agri-value chains. Over to you, Dr. Goel.
Friends, we have got a problem at hand as to how do we move from our projects to a system change. Now, when we talk of projects, they are largely confined only to one small part of agri-vertical or a very small part of agri-value chain. But the entire value chain in the field of agriculture involves very large number of disciplines and stakeholders. There are researchers and innovations who bring these projects, innovations, but then it is a large number of implementing organizations, whether in government or in private sector, the business community involved in supply of inputs, technologies, or off-taking of the product grown by the farmers. Then there are policymakers, there are donors, there are investment community involved. But most important of that, on one end of the value chain, we have farmers, that is the growers, and on the other end, the consumers. So it is a large number of dots which needs to be connected if any project innovation is to be scaled up, and that seems to be the biggest challenge. The stakeholders are all across the value chain, but the innovative projects would have probably only one of them or maybe two. The challenge therefore lies is how do we connect these dots which are lying in different areas of silos and full of agri-verticals. They are devoid of agri-horizontals. In fact, there are very few structures who bring these distinct parts of a value chain in a horizontal fashion, connecting farmers to the consumers. And that is the biggest challenge. So if we want to scale up projects into a kind of a value chain, or we scale up in a bigger way so that they are adopted by a larger community of the farmers and the consumers, they have to be woven into a value chain where all other parts are also stitched together. So therefore, to meet this challenge, in fact, there are newer opportunities with us. We are thinking of transforming food system, and a food system necessarily means various components of the value chain, which starts from growers and end with the consumers, and even beyond that. And the second opportunity which is with us is to create those kind of facilitating value chain structures which can give rise to very large number of business opportunities, not only for the greater employment, but also removing many of the intermediaries which are bringing the inefficiencies in the current food system. So the opportunities are huge. How do we really nurture and take benefit out of these opportunities? Most important part is that we have a systemic change into the present system, and that to bring in the systemic change, we have to have a creation of a digital value chain platform, and digital value chain platform to onboard all the components of the value chain which are driven by various stakeholders, and by this system facilitating a cadre of service providers in terms of let us call them agri architects, and these architects will be experts in bringing these diverse players across the value chain. They may not owning up any part of the agri verticals, but their expertise is in stitching various players together. Another way of looking at it, how do we do it, is getting the stakeholders horizontally integrating through new systems of agri startups. Most of the startups are still interested only in the verticals and not in the horizontals. New small and medium enterprises, they can also open up the opportunities in this direction. There could be multilateral institutions which can create these platforms. Another way of looking at it is to have a new system of public-private partnerships which are driven by the government and the private sector together, for which one would require the creation of multi-stakeholder platforms, the way the World Economic Forum is thinking of, to have agri-value system platforms in India. This is a tall order, and it will take time when these systemic changes are made. Now, in this roadmap, what is the role of government? First is certainly in the policy space. There are many countries where the public-private partnership platforms are still not quite created. There are no digital platforms which are available in public domain, which can be used by the stakeholders to ride on any localized value chain. These have to be created. An ecosystem will have to be developed for attracting investment in the field of agriculture. For example, there could be an organizations like Agri Investment Promotion Board, where the private sector players could approach and be a part of government interventions woven into the entire value chain. The government will have to play a role to have a regulatory system which is conducive to this kind of value chain integration. To give an example, most of the developing countries are having problems with the structures in the marketing. These are disjointed structures, and what may require the marketing reforms to carry out. Contract farming will have to be promoted, for which the government will have to play a facilitating role. In short, it will not be a regulation which is stifling the agricultural investment, but facilitating and promoting all kinds of service providers for horizontal integration. What is the role of the private sector? The private sector will have to come up very quickly a digital value chain backbone to make it available for newer kind of innovations which have to come up, which are still missing. The private sector will have to take initiatives for creating a cadre of service providers what, as I mentioned earlier, a kind of ag architects. And this is the kind of new startups which will be there in addition to what is being done in terms of promoting various innovations. What are the examples? Is there any success story? Yes, it is. In India, public-private partnership for integrated agriculture development, a program was floated in the year 2012. And in the western state of India, known as Maharashtra, 500,000 farmers were able to come together in 33 value chains, and the total investment which was flowing into it over a period of 3 years were more than $50 million. At the national and international level, if we look at it, the new vision on agriculture by World Economic Forum has been spearheading this example of bringing the multi-stakeholders together in 25 countries, and the investment since 2009 has been more than $10 billion. This has been now expanded into a global food initiative, and the work is in progress. In India, the initial example of only $500,000 has now been upscaled into multi-stakeholder platforms promoted by World Bank and ADB in 3 parallel projects. The total investment of $1 billion. And these 1 million farmers, imagine something which is started with 500,000 farmers over a period of 3 years have grown into a movement to cover more than 1 million farmers in terms of localized value chain. I think that is the way forward for future. Thanks very much for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Goel. Again, some insightful comments there. And again, I want to welcome the audience to ask any questions that you might have of Dr. Goel or of any panelists. And if I could ask the panelists to turn their cameras on now so we could see them there. Terrific. I see them all coming in, and great to have you dialing in from around the world and joining us here on this panel. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the first question, which I'll ask each of you to answer in turn, starting in the same order we proceeded with Dr. Cole, then moving on to Dr. Kovic, Dr. Ferris, and Dr. Goel. So here's the question. I'll read it word for word, and you can interpret it and answer it how you like. Is system change a requisite for real change, or are psychological and technical changes necessary for system change? In other words, which comes first? Let's start with you, Dr. Cole. And Dr. Cole, you might be muted. Check your settings there.
Sorry, thanks. Thank you, Tim. Perhaps I'm revealing my training as an economist. I think it depends. But in my experience, most of the time, systems change does in fact comes first, though there are cases where changes in mindsets or approaches are more important. I think it depends on what you're doing. In cases, for example, where outcomes in scaling that have to do with gender equity or intra-household power relationships are quite critical in agriculture and nutrition, then mindsets are at least co-equal, if not part of it. But I think in general, there's sort of this mistake that many of us make in scaling, that thinking that simply getting farmers or other key actors to adopt an innovation is sufficient without transforming either parts of the value chain to support it. And that needs really to be co-equal with introducing innovations. Otherwise, the innovations either the scale they achieve is limited, the sustainability is limited, and particularly issues that I've seen are both upstream and downstream. Often access to key inputs and other types of support are missing. And as productivity or other things increase, access to markets is limited. And if you don't, I think the case that I mentioned in my talk, the Sahel rice example is a really good example of that As farmer productivity increased, they found there were not places to get their rice processed, and as the processing increased, there was no place to sell it. Julie Howard asked in the chat about how has systems change and scaling evolved, and I think one of the key evolutions is first and foremost that just this sort of plug-and-play version of scaling that we try to work with national agricultural systems, especially extension systems, and expect them to scale things when in fact those systems are often quite limited, underfunded, etc., is just insufficient. And secondly, their reach is often limited, and the same of commercial value chains. So if we're interested in reaching the smallest farmers, the marginal farmers, and particularly addressing gender equity issues and others, then we need to engage with the whole system and really think about a much more transformational approach to systems change as opposed to just doing the minimum to get farmers to adopt it. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Dr. Cole. Let's turn now to Dr. Kovic on that same question. Dr. Kovic.
Yes, I think like the previous speaker, it really depends. Sometimes technologies, if they address a specific problem that needs to be addressed, they can actually propel change in the system. And a really good example is how cell phone technologies are changing the way in which we access markets. And Kenya is a very good example for that in terms of how they are using mobile technologies. But when we are stuck in our mindsets and we are not thinking beyond the current realities, at that point, a change in mindset can then trigger technology change where somebody questions, is this the only way of doing things? Right now, we are questioning the extensive monoculture perspectives and overuse of inputs and what have you. And that is leading to some rumbles in the system with agroecological processes coming on board. So it works, I think, both ways depending on the context. I think what is important is to ensure that from a policy perspective, we create an enabling environment for these changes to be able to take root and actually bring about systems change. And therefore, I think for informing those in the policy-making space of the challenges that are at hand and that there might be solutions, then becomes important in trying to create that enabling environment. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Dr. Kovic. Turn now to Dr. Ferris. Same question.
Thanks. Great question. So, I think it depends a little bit on the situation. As the previous speaker has said, some problems are very pressing, and that sort of helps innovations to fill those gaps. It's a different kind of process. But if you just think about those three stages in the scaling approach, a lot of technologies are innovated, developed. Not all of those have a direct market pull. But you have to go, if you're looking to see a process of scaling, I think it depends on the gravity of the demand or the problem, the networks that are put in place to actually share those new ideas, and then having the financing to propel them. And I think that's one of the more challenging transitions that has to take place, as in an innovation idea is generally developed through a think tank, a small innovation or an entrepreneur, but they then have to take that idea to the next set of people who can test it in many locations. Again, that's a different type of financing that is required for that. And then you start to build a business case to actually then take that to a very large scale. It does take, it's either, like a health intervention, which would go primarily through a state level kind of financing process. But if it is something that's very demand driven through a market-based system, then you've got to have, the whole marketing system in place. So it's clearly a process. It needs different strategies at different stages in that scaling approach. And I think it needs a lot of different financing mechanisms to really go from a great idea to actually being something that people can buy and is affordable to them and fits the need. So It's not just one or two things. It's a lot of different things that need to come together. And I think that's what Dr. Cole was saying in his opening remarks. There are many different parts in this process, and you've got to use a lot of those different levers, or pull a lot of those different levers to see a good idea actually, being made available to lots of people and then being taken up by the market. Over.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Ferris. And now over to you, Dr. Goel in Maharashtra.
Tim, agriculture is necessarily a multi-stakeholder process. And multi-stakeholder platforms would necessarily require different players to come together. Now, that coming together itself requires a change in the mindset, because they are used to work in their own silos and in various verticals. So the starting point is that there is a problem and there is something which is to be delivered to the community, and therefore we have to come together. So change of mindset or the psychological barriers will have to be broken first. But after that, the scaling would necessarily require a kind of systemic change, because the whatever is happening is a part of the systemic deficiencies, because of which the development goals have not been achieved, or any innovation maybe in the public domain has still not been adopted. So my answer to your question would be, we require both in succession. The sequence may be different in some cases, but the first thing would be the mindset change, the psychological acceptance of coming together, followed by the systemic change. And unless that continues with full force, the possibility that we will go from a project to a system change would be remote. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Dr. Goel, and thank you to all the panelists for the lively discussion here. I want to ask audience members again, just post those questions in the chat. Keep them coming. What I have is another question for all four panelists here, and then we'll go to some individual questions. So here's the question for all four panelists, and again, we'll take it in the same order. Question word for word: how do the panelists see local genetic resources for food and agriculture and their associated knowledge in scaling? Dr. Cole? Oh, sorry, Dr. Cole. Again, look at your mute there. Yeah, thanks.
Sorry. I think genetic resources are quite important place to start, and I think the CG centers working with national systems have done good work in developing things. I think, though, the basic challenge has been getting them out into the field in terms of varieties that are particularly suited to the market. I would say that the major challenges are these links, the commercialization links. Most of the people who work at CG centers or NARs are not skilled in commercialization. They're researchers, they're they're breeders. And they, at least historically, have not done a good job of really assessing what are the market needs and how to link with commercial breeders in cases, at least, where it's a commercializable crop. I realize not all crops are that way. And so I think this is the principal challenge we face. And that's where I think more work needs to be done on scaling, is creating particularly incentives and skills in the centers that own those genetic materials or produce those genetic materials to link them to commercial markets. Stop there. Over.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Cole. Dr. Kovic?
Yeah, I think the existence of gene banks as part of the CG system and for some governments is an important aspect of having a pipeline of genetic resources to feed into the breeding process. The challenge that I see is the fact that, and I'm not really a geneticist, but the challenge that I see is I question whether we are collecting enough of those genetic resources. If I look at the African continent, we still have a very diverse biological food basket, if you will. And I'm calling it a biological food basket on purpose because they may not necessarily be on the plate, but they are there in the ecosystem. And the extent to which those resources are being incorporated into the gene banks for me is not clear. And if we ignore them at our peril, because future systems change given the way the climate is changing will depend on that as resources for genetic breeding. When it comes to specifically what is happening now, the area where I find more needs to be done is on breeding crops such as legumes and pulses that are generally self-pollinated, and they don't seem to have gotten as much attention. And yet, this is the place where our food systems transformation will rely for greater diversity, nutrients, and also for soil health management, incorporating legumes into our agriculture cropping system. And so that area, to me, as part of moving towards system change, I think is not getting the attention it deserves. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kovacs. Very good. That's great to hear from you on that. Let's turn now to Dr. Ferris.
Yeah, no, the seed debate is one which is, has been on the agenda for a very long time. I think if you look at the influence of hybrid maize and, getting that new genetics to the farming community, you have the absolutely classic hockey stick scaling process. And, this comes back to what the previous question was trying to get to. I think, is it a change from the farmer, that sort of psychological change? Is it a great innovation which fills a gap? And, what is the market pull or the state push, if you like, to get that idea to scale? And when you look at hybrid crops, maize being one, but also, hybrid vegetables, the shift in that technology compared to local varieties is enormous. So just take maize over the last 40 years or 50 years, it's gone from 1 metric ton per hectare to over 10 metric tons per hectare in areas that are using the full package of the inputs plus those hybrid seeds. Now that fills a real gap. So suddenly you've got access to a lot of calories or a lot of food resources with a very rapid uptake of that type of technology. And maize across Africa as well has spread remarkably quickly, all through largely through smallholder farms, but all of those farmers buying, or many of them, buying hybrid maize. And particularly those farmers that are in more commercial areas, as in more productive land, but better links to markets. But as Dr. Kovacs has also said, on the other hand, outside of vegetables and maize, the uptake of genetics has been fairly low. And, there are lots of reasons for that. The fact is that you can use the same seed for 5 years, maybe 10 years. In some cases, people are using old CG varieties of beans that are 30 years old, still doing fine. So they've got the product. They don't need to go back to the market again, and so they don't. And so, you've got to then look at, are people making sensible decisions on this? And I think they are. For the hybrids, they have to go back every year to get that same kick from the seed. But with the self-pollinated crops, they don't need to, and they don't. And so it's all about filling those gaps. So that's where you've got to be really careful about that. And unless the commercialization environment changes around you, the pull for those new crops is going to be slow, I think. So, yeah, it's not just one thing. It's many parts of a puzzle that you've got to get right.
Thanks, Dr. Ferris. Dr. Gold?
Yeah, Tim, it looks like that the debate on local genetic resources have been dominated by the indigenous communities and civil society organizations, not by businesses. And it is not where the people are talking about the entire value chain. It is not where the people are talking about beyond environmental sustainability in terms of food and nutritional security, along with economic opportunities. The farmers will adopt it when they see a income out of it. And just to say that, yes, this genetic material is superior, that is not enough for a farmer, particularly for a smallholder farmer, to just go for it. So I would say that if there are cases where we are able to demonstrate that a localized value chain would be beneficial on all accounts, including environment sustainability, food and nutritional security, and as well as economic opportunities for all those who are involved in the value chain, the talk of indigenous or local genetic material will remain incomplete. And it will require a complete value chain acceptance, without which such kind of discussions will remain on papers and the topic of webinars.
Terrific. Thank you, Dr. Goel, and thank you to all the panelists for sharing your thoughts on that important question. Before I go to individual questions, I've got a good one that just came in over the wire here, and I'll ask all four of you, and jump in as you want. You can jump in any order. Just raise your hand if you'd like to speak. Here's the question. We're talking about systems change. We're talking about mindset change. But what type of change and who decides this? How do we avoid unintended consequences? Instead of creating solutions, we create a bigger problem. Challenging questions related to this discussion. Who would like to take a shot at answering that? It's a big one.
I'm happy to go first.
Go for it. And go for it, Dr. Then we'll go to Dr. Goel. Thank you.
I think the whole
yeah, go ahead.
I think the whole point of taking a systems view is to avoid that trade-off of creating a bigger problem than what we are solving. And so it's really critical that any changes that are promoted, it's clear that we are actually looking at the whole food systems to actually connect the dots of where things might go wrong and which trajectory would that lead us in. So to me, the whole point of taking a food systems perspective is to try and avoid those trade-offs, because what we are trying to solve now is trade-offs that we have gained from our previous efforts to where we are at the moment. So really the big answer for me is take a food systems perspective to it, look at where the dots connect or they do not, and in doing so, we can avoid creating a bigger problem than what we are addressing. Thank you.
Terrific, thank you. Dr. Goel, what type of change? Who decides?
Yeah, the change cannot be driven by just few intellectuals. The change is the process of a general consensus of all multi-stakeholders who are involved in terms of maybe even losing or gaining out of a process of change. And that is how I would say the answer would be, it is the multi-stakeholder community which decides about as to what kind of changes are needed, whether they are driven by a particular piece of innovation or whether it is because of a felt need. It has to be the acceptance of all those multi-stakeholder partners in the entire value chain with which this change is connected to.
Terrific, thank you. Dr. Cole?
Yeah, I just reinforce the other speakers, but particularly to emphasize, I think one of the problems we have in scaling and system change is that it tends to be largely supply driven. I mean, we've talked a lot implicitly about CG centers, national agricultural systems, and it hasn't come up today, but USAID and others fund innovation labs. And by and large, as I alluded to earlier, those are breeding varieties or developing genetic materials that they think either solve problems or, unfortunately, the incentives are often, well, it publishes a paper and, you get promoted and professional recognition from that. There isn't really demand-driven scaling, whether the demand is from local actors, be they farmers or other value chain actors. And as Dr. Goel just said a minute ago, all the stakeholders have to be bought in, and it's not just a question of bought in principle, but everybody has to make money, at least if it's a commercial operation. And often when I ask breeders or variety developers, how much money can the farmer make, or how much money can the breeder make, or how much money does this the distributor, the agro dealer make, they don't have answers to those questions. So I think using a much more balanced approach, which is at least demand-driven and takes into account the financial incentives and other incentives of all the stakeholders, is quite critical.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Cole. Over to you, Dr. Ferris.
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough one. Okay, so in the case of the CGIAR, they are breeding a series of crops, for areas where, or for a segment of society where quite often the commercial seed companies are not getting to. So, and they're working on crops that have a much lower demand profile than mainly the hybrids that the private sector companies are working on. So there is this trade-off then between the need to scale through the state or the international community, or the opportunity to scale through the private sector. So I think that the CG is in a bit of a tough situation there, because they are being asked to do all three of those scaling ideas. I mean, really, they are the innovators. And quite often, a lot of their material creeps into the commercial private sector seed companies. And so many of the products that are generated over time are being expressed in commercial varieties. But to go from, let's say, a bean variety to do the intermediation as well as the breeding, and then build the business case, and then generate all the things that you need to get a product to an actual farmer, is way beyond what research organizations can do. So there's a whole lot of people that need to be involved in that, and a government policy that actually supports that scaling system. And right now, in many African countries, the state actually prefers to take innovation products from research and literally give them to farmers. That's just a quicker way of them getting the product to the client, if you like. But again, the state is also not hugely empowered. So it's a slow flow of materials getting to the community. And yeah, for that to change, it needs a much more competitive, seed company environment, huge awareness campaigns to farmers so that they see the value in that. And then, unfortunately, a lot of business kind of capacity building within communities so that they can provide products at a more competitive rate versus getting seed from Europe, the US, or other countries. And so they are caught in this really difficult situation of who innovates, who really does the intermediation, and then who is the real scaling partner that can take it to very large numbers of people. My sense is that the battle over time is being won. I think that we expect to see scaling within 1 or 2 years, like an iPhone. Why doesn't the CG produce an iPhone that just suddenly scales? I think these are different markets, and you're looking at generational changes. So, if you look at it on that kind of level, and agriculture is a generational process, I think you'll see scaling at quite a high level compared to what it was with the previous generation of farmers. And, that's, that maybe is frustrating for people. And I think we all share that. But, things take time to change. And, we've got to be patient with some of these things. Over.
Thank you, Dr. Ferris. Yes, agriculture is a traditional business. We still need seeds and water and soil, don't we? It doesn't scale as nicely as those beautiful phones we have in our pockets. But great insights from all four of you. Really great to hear about this. I've got some questions for each of you. What I appreciate about this panel is your quick responses, getting in, getting out, leaving more time to cover more ground. So thank you for quick responses. First question over to Dr. Cole. The principles laid out by Dr. Cole describe a very intentional and logical stepwise approach to scaling. How often is such a deliberate application of scaling seen? Is this the point of the paper, to encourage more logical approach to scaling? Dr. Cole, what do you think?
Thanks for the great question, Tim. I would have to say, well, first of all, I'd like to take a small step back and say, well, what do we mean by scaling? And I would like to suggest that when we use the word scaling, we do so in two ways that are not often common. I think the common notion of scaling is that we reach large numbers of people. And I'd suggest that we go beyond that to think about actually the denominator. because I cannot tell you the number of times I've heard these wonderful stories about millions and hundreds of millions of people, well, not hundreds, but often you'll find out that that's because 10 million people were reached in India out of a farmer population of maybe 500 million. And then there's a 500,000 here, 500,000 there in Africa. And when you think about how big these agricultural populations are, it's peanuts, no pun intended. And so the first thing I would urge is that we really be more ambitious in what we're talking about in scaling is reaching something approaching the size of the problem. If there is 100 million maize farmers, 1 million people is just nothing. We need to really be thinking maybe not 100%, but 50% or 75% seems pretty reasonable. And that's not usually happening. And secondly, even when, one of the previous speakers just talked about giving seed away, well, that's often not sustainable for all the actors, whether farmers who are used to getting it for free, or certainly agri dealers and other commercial breeders that's not a market there. So the reason I make those comments about what do we mean by scale and using the word sustainability and reaching market potential as opposed to some number is that most scaling efforts don't do that. They aren't intentional in that way. And if they are intentional, especially in the context of a donor-funded project, it's to reach a certain number. We've contracted over the next 5 years to reach 500,000 farmers in country X with certain technologies or certain innovations. And that is usually doesn't, as opposed to, we have created the preconditions to reach critical mass, to reach a tipping point so that when our project leaves, the scaling will continue to grow to reach the market potential. The value chain systems, if they needed strengthening, are in place, the enabling policy environment in place. So I think that the existing scaling efforts are often intentional, but they're intentional with the wrong targets. They're intentional about reaching some given target as opposed to creating the preconditions for what I would call large scale or market potential and sustainability. And the goal of the principles paper was to address that and to get people thinking, especially because I think more and more donors and other implementers are talking about scale that way, but they continue to practice in the old way. And by setting out these principles, it's helpful to both identify the gap between the walk and the talk. So thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Cole. Terrific. Over to Dr. Kovic with your beautiful background. It looks like the challenge and opportunity, the green field, the small plots right there behind you. Let me ask you, Dr. Kovic, from our audience here, we have a request. Would you please comment on incentives to farmers to take up vitamin A maize and AflaSafe? Does vitamin A enriched maize get a higher price at the market? And similarly, aflatoxin reduced maize, do farmers get a higher price? Over to you, Dr. Kovic.
Okay, so on the work that was done, the focus was not on getting premium prices to smallholder farmers. The focus was actually the benefits towards the nutrition and health, but also benefits in terms of the farmers themselves having maize they can grow that actually have right agronomic characteristics. And so through nutrition education and including research demonstrating the impact of the vitamin A maize, that nutrition education route went in trying to create demand for the vitamin A maize. Linking those to school feeding and via that route creating demand through government procurement. But in addition to that, the varieties that are actually being produced have positive agronomic characteristics. So they're higher yielding, they handle water stress better. And so the farmers will actually choose them for that reason, if for nothing else. But knowing that by doing so, there's also this added advantage in terms of providing vitamin A to their children and others, it becomes an asset. So I think that is the approach that has been taken, and so far it has worked. The idea of premium prices, I don't know whether that would not even be counterproductive, being they're poor farmers, you increase the price of that maize, then who's going to afford it. It becomes premium maize for the rich, and the same poor farmers you are trying to reach with more vitamin A, you may not be able to reach. On the AFLACEF, it's been a similar perspective. Across the African continent, there's always been trouble where if Kenya has extra maize, Ethiopia won't buy it because they are afraid it's loaded with aflatoxin, and the other way around. So the access to market is what has actually been driving farmers wanting to actually engage with the AFLACEF. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Kovic. We got time for one more. Dr. Ferris, tell us a little more about community resilience monitoring. Who does the monitoring? What are the basic requirements? How does that roll out in places like Malawi versus Sudan? Dr. Ferris,
okay.
Just 1 minute if you don't mind. Thank you.
Yeah, so basically the resilience programming or monitoring systems are done by community enumerators. They are provided with the training. They're given a basic phone, and they essentially interview their communities against a series of shocks and provide information which they load back into the system. The system then analyzes that and provides them with data back, as in how well is that community actually doing relative to a number of shocks that community may be experiencing. And most of the kind of monitoring systems or early warning systems at the moment are very top-down. The idea of this high-frequency monitoring is to build more of a circle of data so that they get information from the outside. They provide information back to decision makers, which may be projects, it may be government, it may be state actors, and they can make more targeted decisions on support to the community. So I think in the past, people have always, in a very data thin environment, people have to send people out, get data back. That takes an incredibly long time. Getting the information on a regular basis from the community basically helps others to help the community. So, it's a very positive process. And I think that's why that type of approach, we'll be seeing more of that in the future.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Really appreciate these answers. And Dr. Cole, sorry we didn't get to your question, but hopefully the audience member can connect with you and ask the question to follow up. We need to wrap up. It's the top of our time here together. And I just want to, first of all, thank the panelists and thank the audience for these great questions. We really covered a lot of ground. Mindset change or tech change. Who does the change? Who really drives it? A linear approach, or do we use adaptive management? Scale, is it 100 million? Is it 1 million? How do we measure resilience? There's been a lot of great questions, a lot of great dialogue, and really thank you all for this wonderful session. And as a reminder, we have another session coming up, session 3, moving from projects to system change, future research agenda. Join us on December 11th. You'll get an email if you're part of this list, and that email will give you instructions on how you can sign up. That promises to be another very lively discussion on system change, which is moderated by Simon Winter. And no doubt there's going to be some more great panelists sharing their wisdom. With that, it's now time for us to end. Thank you once again, and looking forward to any follow-up you have from the questions here and the continued dialogue in scaling innovations. Thank you very much.